right. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone had a good lunch. What an incredible venue we're at. We want to thank Unconventional Diner for hosting us today. For those of you that are in the more networking room, you're going to be able to see this panel, but we'd also love to encourage you to come in, fill in some of these seats so that you can participate and hear from our experts here this afternoon to talk all things health equity. My name is Anna Palmer, the CEO and one of the founders of Punchbowl News. Thanks to so many of you for joining us in person, but also on the live stream as well. I also want to thank, I know we have a lot of our Punch Up ambassadors who are being featured with their quotes in the room. Really want to thank you for your participation, for sharing about this event. We're going to be recognizing you as well at the toast later today. So, we had such an amazing morning. We heard from Representative Lisa Blunt-Rochester, very passionate about health equity and some of the legislation that she's working on. We also had a really interesting fireside chat. I feel like I learned a ton about clinical trial diversity, why it matters, what some of the challenges are, and really, I loved that it was optimistic on the end about kind of what the impact that the partnership between pharma and those colleges are having in terms of impacting care and potentially trials and bringing those closer together. So now, I'm going to bring on our next panel. We have an expert panel today, and our special projects editor, Alvina Nabaguna, is going to moderate that. They're going to talk all things health equity, and I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. Hi, everyone. I hope you had a scrumpty, delicious lunch today. Thank you again for joining us. We're very excited to, I should sit down, I guess. That was expected of me. We're very excited to get started with this new session on a discussion on the state of the healthcare system 1 year after the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. We have a wonderful panel to help us frame the conversation. Your titles are very long, so let me read them. Stephanie Dyson, Vice President for U.S. Policy and Government Affairs at Bristol Myers Squibb. And then we have Dr. Pause for effect. Okay. And then we have Dr. Gary Puckrein, President and CEO of the National Minority Quality Forum. And Eric Gascho, Senior Vice President for Policy and Government Affairs at the National Health Council. Thank you all for joining us. As a woman of color who has had first-hand experience with the complicated healthcare system in the US, like many of you have, I'm very honored to be anchoring us in this discussion. So let's get right into it. I'm going to start with you, Stephanie, just because you're right next to me.
You're looking
at me. As a representative of a leading pharmaceutical company, can you give us a quick overview of how things have changed since the IRA was signed into law a year ago, or if nothing has changed?
No, absolutely. Things are changing. I would say, as you guys have heard, I work for Bristol Myers Squibb. I'm also a registered nurse by background. And so I chose to work in this industry because of the value that we can provide with the biopharm industry. And where we are similar to some of our patient groups in that there were things within the IRA that would help patients with out-of-pocket costs, we're also very concerned over the so-called negotiation part of the IRA. We do believe that the negotiation, I would use air quotes, would have a detrimental impact on R&D, on innovation, and you think about the minority population and the fact that we need readily access to medicines, then we think that can be disruptive. And quite frankly, we think that the negotiation part was unconstitutional.
We're going to talk more about the negotiation. And I know the Biden administration just released its list of the first 10 drugs to be negotiated, and Eliquis, which you make for, is one of those. So I'm sure you have some thoughts on that. But
I will.
But let's get to Gary. I want to bring. Let me first turn to Eric. Your organization advocates for millions of people who are living with chronic illnesses and disabilities. And we know a huge portion of those are people of color and underrepresented communities. Are you seeing drug costs come down for the 160 plus million people you represent? I know that cutting costs and capping prices was a big part of the IRA. Talk to us about that.
Sure, and I think it's going to be really important as we talk about the IRA to remember it is a big, sprawling piece of legislation just within healthcare alone. So when you think about many of the provisions that are included in that, some of them are going to have different impacts. I think we heard a lot this morning about the $35 cap on insulin, on the vaccines without cost sharing, or as we learned today to call it, free vaccines. These things are already in effect. They're already having an impact. They're already really delivering affordability and access for folks. Coming up in the coming years, we're also going to see a cap on out-of-pocket costs at $2,000, and really importantly, allowing people to spread those over the course of a calendar year to help with budgeting. So there's a lot of really important things that have gone into effect and that are going into effect. Then, of course, there's the negotiation piece of it as well, which I think, it's going to be really hard to determine that at this point in time what the impacts are going to be on access and affordability, because we are throwing them into a healthcare system that has so many misaligned and backwards incentives that we're really going to have to make sure that we're ensuring that that part of the law has its intended effect to increase access and affordability, and I think there's still some work to be done there.
And I want to bring Gary into this as well. Your work is focused on making sure that underrepresented populations have access to healthcare. And you have direct access to data, and you hear directly from the communities you work with. What are you hearing on from the field about people's, how it's changing things for them, or what their hopes are with the IRA?
The first thing I would want to do is really set the stage here. There's an emerging market in American healthcare. You don't hear a lot about it. But because of the demographic shift, if you look at California, Texas, New Mexico, Maryland, New York, Florida, those are all emerging markets. What I mean by emerging markets, they have not had access to frontline medicines before. And so the critical question that we're asking is, so how are things going to change now for this emerging market? Because guess what? Because they're becoming the majority, if we don't take care of them, we're not going to have a workforce, we're not going to have a military. And a lot of times when I'm in the room, it doesn't look as diverse as this. This is a very diverse room, but oftentimes here in DC, it is not diverse. They're not thinking about the market. So if you go in and you look at that IRA guidance, and you should go Google it, take a look at it, nothing about diversity, nothing about patient outcomes. It's all about a money conversation. And where we are right now is we need to think about patients. One of the most important things that I remember, and I'm going to be quiet, is that life expectancy has expanded. We've invested in life expectancy. That's what we're doing. That's not what we're talking about. We are talking money. I want to talk about life.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary.
Okay, Gary.
Let me stick on the theme of patient perspectives for a second here. Eric, we know that patient engagement and input is very crucial in healthcare policy. How does the National Health Council collaborate with the government and the private sector, including pharmaceutical companies, to ensure that patient perspectives are considered in the implementation of the IRA?
Sure, and so I think one of the biggest successes we've had over the last decade has been within patient-focused drug development at the Food and Drug Administration, where for far too long, people were speaking for patients in terms of what are the outcomes that matter most to them, what are their views on benefits and risks and side effects. But over the last decade, there's been a lot of work, tremendous work done by the FDA and the drug industry and the device industry, quite frankly, as well, to really focus in on those outcomes that matter to patients and really make sure that they're researching and developing and bringing to market those types of products. What's going to be really important as we think about the Inflation Reduction Act implementation is that information then carrying through into the decisions that CMS is making? We've talked a lot about the work that the FDA has done. This is sort of a new adventure for CMS to really be bringing in that patient perspective into the work that they're doing. We're pleased to see that they did put forward some listening sessions for the drugs that are being negotiated. We think there's probably some room for improvement in terms of the format of them, but it is the first time they've really done something like this, and I think potentially could be a really big sea change at the agency, not just for negotiation, but for all of the work that CMS does in terms of coverage and access.
Thank you, Eric. Do you want to chime in on that, how the different sectors can collaborate, both private sector, government, non-profits, how they can collaborate to make sure that patient perspectives are taken into consideration?
Absolutely. At BMS, we always think about patients first, and we have a patient-centric approach as well. And so when we look at different policies and the impact that they have on the patients that we serve, we're always thinking about how do we ensure patients ultimately have access to our medicines. And if you think about the IRA specifically in the so-called negotiation, one of the issues that we have concern with is that after a drug goes through the negotiation, there is no guarantee from the government that the patient is going to have the same access to formulary. And so we want to ensure that we're thinking about how do we interact with the government is how do we ensure that patients have access to not just our medicines, but to all health care, quite frankly.
Let me stick with you, Stephanie. One of the key features of the IRA is negotiating prices and capping, obviously, out-of-pocket costs, as we've talked about, for very important medicines for diseases like diabetes and cancers and cardiovascular issues. There's been some push and pull in the industry. How do you perceive the balance between the IRA's goal of controlling drug prices and the need for continued innovation and development of life-saving medications?
Absolutely. We think patient access and innovation should be first and foremost. And you think about the so-called negotiation, BMS has the privilege of having Eliquis have the #1 spot on the Medicare list for expenditures, but it's really not there because of price. The government and Congress have repeatedly said that negotiation, the so-called negotiation, is there because of high-priced medications. Eliquis is there because of its value. Since its inception, it was we had developed it in 2012. It's treated almost 11 million Medicare patients. And so you think about a product that's there for value. And today, most of those patients spend no more than about $55 out of pocket. So again, it goes back to the access. There is no guarantee by CMS that after a drug goes through this so-called negotiation that out-of-pocket cost is going to stay the same. And so there is this push-pull because we want to ensure that we bring access to patients, and we also want to ensure there's a sustainable system. And you think about Eliquis, the #1 drug, its value has proven over and over again. And stroke and diabetes, as we mentioned here, twice as likely to impact African American communities as white communities. And we want to make sure that the patients continue to have access to those products.
What do you mean by what does a sustainable system look like?
Honestly, sustainability thinks about the continuum of care and all of the healthcare players. And so you think about the dollars that we spend in healthcare, pharmaceuticals are only 10% of that spend. So sustainability means that the PBMs or the middlemen and the hospitals and providers, that everyone is participating, thinking about that bottom line and access to patients and the totality of the care, not a unique focus on biopharm.
Thank you for that. Gary, given your organization's focus on improving healthcare quality, could you discuss any potential quality of care implications stemming from the law's provisions and their impact on minority communities?
Well, part of the challenge, and I think Gary hit it right on the head, we don't know, right? We've opened up Pandora's box, and we don't know what it's going to look like. What we're focused on is, we call it mitigating patient risk. So when you think about it, the real purpose of healthcare is to keep people out of the hospital, keep them out of the emergency room, keep them from disability, keep them from dying, and making sure they have a high quality life. You have to pay for that. Somewhere along the way, you have to pay for that. What's happening right now in the minority populations, the system is actually elevating their risk. When they go into a medical establishment, instead of them getting frontline therapy, they're not getting frontline therapy. And as a consequence, what we see is African Americans have a 200% hospitalization rate for heart failure, because guess what? We're not giving them frontline medicine. When you look at diabetes, 60% of everybody in the Medicare program has an emergency room visit or an inpatient stay for diabetes. That's where the cost is. 90% of the cost for diabetes is hospitalization. It's not drugs, right? And the program doesn't do anything about it. If you go in and you look at the data from 2015 to 2020, before the pandemic, complete flatline for hospitalizations, complete flatlines for emergency room visits. And you know what that says to me? It's a dumb system. It's not learning. It's not helping people avoid those hospitalizations. That's where we're focused. We're focused on patient outcomes. And guess what? It's an investment. What we want to do is we want to make sure that the next generation doesn't have to live that way. That's what the science is about, and that's what the conversation has to be focused on, and we're not focusing on it. You need to go up to Capitol Hill and ask members to please help you, because they are the fiduciary agents. Get on the job and make sure that we get better outcomes for the American people. That's where we got to go.
Eric, do you want to chime in on that as well, on the quality of life implications?
Yeah, so I think, again, we still don't know a lot of what we don't know. So I think one of the things that we really wanted to make sure that we are doing, during the implementation as we move forward is really making sure there's that feedback loop in place to really make sure that we are tracking what the impacts are going to be. And so that's something that certainly within the patient advocacy community, who have a lot of really fantastic tools and resources for their communities to help them live their best lives and navigate the healthcare system, to really be tracking what a lot of these impacts are going to be so that we can then feed that back to the agency and potentially to Congress if we need to have legislative change as well.
I hear you both echoing what Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester was saying earlier, like making sure future generations have better outcomes and better access. I think we can all get behind that. So I want to pose a question to all of you, our wonderful panelists. What did the IRA, it's a three-part question, so let me first start with this. What did the IRA get right in terms of healthcare costs, and improving access? Yes, you can start.
That's a tongue twister.
It is a tongue twister. For me, it's a two-part answer, because BMS has long stood for ensuring, again, the sustainability for patients and ensuring that patients have lower out-of-pocket. But you cannot look at the IRA in a myopic fashion, because the out-of-pocket for the $2,000 a year for Part D doesn't come without thinking about the so-called negotiation. And so we want the government, we want members of Congress, the president to know that, as Gary and Eric has stated, this healthcare system isn't about myopically thinking about biopharm. It's thinking about the continuum of the system, and you really can't fix one part without thinking about the other. And so I don't have an answer of what they got right. It's thinking about we have to think about the totality of the legislation. And you can't do that without thinking about the detriment that the so-called negotiation can bring about.
Gary, what did the IRA get right?
Well, I think the answer is, the honest answer is, we don't know, right? And again, I'm looking at it from the lens of the patient. What am I going to do about that patient who just got diagnosed with cancer? So you're asking me, did the IRA do something there? I don't know. What am I going to do with the patient who just got diagnosed with diabetes? If you look at the IRA, those 10 drugs, 7 of them have to deal with either diabetes or cardiovascular disease. Is it going to improve that? And that's the question that we have to answer. You know what the real problem is here? The real problem is, if I asked you, how much would you like to spend to keep your mother and father alive, or yourself alive, or your kid alive, you got the answer. But if I ask you, how much would you like to spend to keep your neighbor alive, that's where you get confused at, because you don't want to have that conversation about your neighbor's health. And what I'm saying to you is, we're bound together. Your neighbor can't get healthy, and you can't get healthy. We all have to do this together, and it takes money and investment. That's what I see. I don't know what anybody else sees. That's what we think about. How do we keep people healthy? My family, my neighbors, my friend, the guy in the park that I don't know sleeping in the tent. How do I keep him healthy? That's the conversation you have to have with yourself. If you can answer that question, then I can tell you what IRA is doing.
Eric, what did the IRA get right?
So I noticed nobody has directly answered the question, and
We're trying here.
I'm going to follow that trend to an extent. I'll try my best. So what did I get right? I think there's a lot to really like within this, but even all of those have some things that come with them as well. $35 cap on insulin, great. Would have loved to see that be in other markets as well. Would also like to see that be applied to other chronic disease medications. Out-of-pocket cap on costs, $2,000. Fantastic. Always love to see it lower. Also, really want to make sure that it's not creating new incentives in the market. So I think one concern that we have is that with more of that expense going away from the government to the insurer, does that mean that we have new layers and barriers to access, whether it be utilization management, step therapy, higher cost sharing tiers, et cetera? Allowing people to spread that over the course of the calendar year, great, incredibly complex. It's going to require everyone in the room here together and everyone in the healthcare system making sure that people know that option is available because people have to opt into it. So there's a lot that we like that's in it, but a lot of it is really going to require more work to be done to make sure that it works as well as it's intended and doesn't have unintended consequences.
So you kind of got into what the second part of the question was going to be was, what do you want to see done differently with the IRA if Congress was to improve it? So if you want to add to that, I can give you a second, or we can move to Gary and then back to Stephanie.
I can weigh on. So I think, again, a lot of it's going to be required. It's going to be dependent on tracking and monitoring all the impacts, both by CMS as well as Congress and the stakeholder community. I think there's a couple things that we already know we want to be looking at pretty closely. I think what the impacts are on orphan drug innovation. I think there's been a lot of conversation about maybe some tweaks to how the exemption was laid out there. I think there's a lot of agreement in the healthcare system that something needs to be tweaked there, but I think there's still some work to be done in terms of figuring out what exactly that looks like. And yeah, I think that's one of the ones that we know, and then certainly a lot can be addressed through implementation as well. We know that CMS has said everything they've put out so far is just for the first year. They're going to be making changes over future years, but it'd be helpful to know what exactly that process looks like for how they're going to collect that information to make those changes.
Before I move on, can you just explain what orphan drugs are, just in case some people don't understand what that means?
Yeah, exactly. So orphan drug are for drugs that treat very small patient populations, and they have very unique challenges in terms of bringing those to market with less incentive, with a smaller market to bring folks. So there's been a lot of work over decades that Congress has done to make sure that there are incentives in place to make sure that those come to market. There is an exemption in the IRA from the negotiation program for ones that treat an orphan indication, but there's a lot of products that treat multiple indications, multiple orphan and rare diseases, and so there's some concern about how that provision was laid out, and probably there'll be a lot of conversations about potentially tweaking it.
Thank you, Eric. Gary, do you want to tell us what you want Congress to do differently with this law?
First thing I have to say, CMS is only doing what Congress asked them to do. So I want to make sure that everybody understands that they're not operating outside of what our legislators asked them to do. Sometimes in our staff, when we have staff meetings, I tell them that, a tortoise lives to be 250 years, and we're supposed to be smarter than the tortoise. And so I want to go chase the tortoise. I want Congress to help me chase the tortoise, right? Because that's what we're trying to do. Think about it. We are trying to control health outcomes. That's the purpose. That's the game. That's what we're investing in. If DOD said I need a bigger tank, and nobody in the room is going to say, DOD, you can't have the tank. But we want to say we want something to cure cancer. Oh my God, we can't afford that. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. We want the focus on patient outcomes. We want to have a system that is investing in building and monitoring and making sure those dollars get spent wisely. But the point of the day, at the end of the day, where we want to be in 2050 is that we want to pass the baton off to the next generation and said, we've done our job. We have conquered diseases that affected human populations forever. And we're that smart, we're that clever, we can do that. I don't understand why we're not, but certainly we should go up to Congress and ask them, hey guys, can we perhaps get this done? That's what I'd like to see IRA be about.
Stephanie?
For me, I would say two things very clearly. One, if Congress was going to force companies into negotiation, then the savings should directly help patients. The way the IRA is structured today, the savings that the governments say that they're going to actualize from the forced negotiations does not go at all to help patients out of pocket. So that Eliquis patient who's paying an average of $55 per month today, there is no guarantee that that's not going to go up, and Congress has not put in place any measure to guarantee that it would even be lowered. And I would say if we're going to lower what we're paying to the government, patients should have benefited. I think that's what we all agree to. Secondly, I think Congress should have looked at the totality of the healthcare system. I think they had a unique opportunity to look at the total cost of healthcare, and instead I feel as though it was this myopic perception of if we go to biopharm, then everything's going to be okay. And so I think it was a missed opportunity, quite frankly.
We've got a few more minutes left. One last lightning round. What are you hearing back from your conversations as you advocate for your company, the communities you advocate for? What are you hearing back when you talk to members of Congress or the administration? Any signs of agreement with you? Any signs that they might listen to you? You can start.
Yeah, I would say what we're hearing a lot about is what's so-called the pill penalty, and so Congress has arbitrarily set a lesser standard for pills than they have for the large molecules or the biologics, and so what we're hearing is that patients want to ensure that from a health equity perspective, if you're in a community, if you're in a rural community, if you're in a difficult position to access health care, then we want to ensure that those incentives and the standards are the same and equal for the small molecules as they are the large molecules. So for us, a lot of talk around ensuring fairness in the system.
Gary?
You know, what we hear from payers and everybody in the system, government, et cetera, is they really want to pay for outcomes. They really do want to make sure that everyone gets best care. The challenge is they haven't figured out how to do it. We haven't given them the permission and the environment to have that conversation. We talk about the paradigm shift. We think this is about the paradigm shift, where we begin to rethink how we do healthcare. Because in the 20th century, we didn't have the science and technology that we have right now. We are living in a different space. We have different capabilities, and we need to be able to create an environment where we can maximize our capabilities. And when I talk to payers, I hear them saying they want to do that. They need to figure out how it gets done. And I think that's where we need to be. We need to create those opportunities, use the data, the analysis, all of that capability. I think we can change the world. I really do.
Yeah. And Eric, you get to claim the last 30 seconds.
That's always fun. So I want to really echo a lot of what Stephanie had to say as well. I think, we were at a unique moment in time, but I think there's still a moment in time to really be focusing in on a more holistic conversation about the healthcare system. Certainly, I don't want to underscore the point that people do have a hard time affording their pharmaceutical drugs. They have a hard time affording their doctor visits as well. They have a hard time when they end up in the hospital. And so I think, we really want to make sure that as we're thinking about creating a more equitable healthcare system, we really are taking that holistic view on healthcare and on health, and to really make sure that we are not squeezing the balloon on one end and really having a pop out at the other. And so I think, that's one thing that we talk a lot about within the patient community is really making sure that, everyone has a place to blame, in all honesty, but everyone has a place to really help patients as well. And so taking it from one end and putting it to the other is really important.
Thank you very much for this wonderful and lively discussion. Thank you, Gary, Stephanie, and Eric. And thank you all for sticking with us. And don't go away. We're going to transition into community time to engage and network before our final toast. So don't go anywhere. Thank you again. We'll see you around.